The clock secret. What it told Dolly on her birthday. Dolly Dimple sat quietly on a plush rug in the grand old hallway, lost in thought. This was no ordinary hallway. It belonged to a house over 100 years old, one of those rambling, ancient homes filled with secrets and stories. Dolly had been born in this house, just like her mother and grandmother before her. It was their sanctuary, a place filled with warmth and the whispers of the past. But today, something was different. The house felt alive in a way Dolly had never noticed before, especially the tall, silent clock standing guard at the top of the grand staircase. The hallway where Dolly sat was her favorite place in the whole house. The wooden floor gleamed under the glow of the fireplace, and the dark wood-paneled walls gave the room an air of mystery. The fireplace crackled, sending out warmth and light, casting dancing shadows across the room. Dolly loved to imagine that the logs whispered tales from the forest they came from, and the flickering flames painted pictures of long-ago adventures. Nearby, the tall clock stood, its grand face gazing down, almost like it was watching over her. This clock was no ordinary timekeeper. Its glass door revealed its inner workings, the still pendulum and weights that hadn't moved for many years. Yet, despite its motionless state, Dolly was convinced the clock was magical. It smiled at her when she was happy, and its face seemed to frown when she was sad. On days when she was cross, Dolly swore the clock looked at her with disappointment, almost as if it was scolding her. And most mysteriously, the clock still chimed, even though its gears hadn't turned in ages. What puzzled Dolly the most was that the clock would strike at odd moments. It never followed any proper schedule. Sometimes it would chime 10 times when it was nowhere near 10 o'clock, or it would strike 17. And this morning, something even stranger had happened. The clock had chimed 5 times, just as the sun rose. 5 chimes for her 5th birthday. Dolly had no idea how the clock could have known. As she curled up on her rug by the fire, she thought about the magical old clock, its mysteries filling her mind, until her eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the fire lulled her, and soon the soft crackle of the flames began to fade. The world around her became quieter and quieter. Then, out of nowhere, a creaky voice broke the silence. "Dolly! Dolly Dimple!" the voice croaked. Dolly's eyes flew open, her heart racing. Where had the voice come from? She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously across the room. Had she imagined it? But then she looked at the clock. Its grand face had changed. It no longer had its usual kind expression. Instead, it looked alive, like it had something important to say. "Would you like to hear a story, Dolly?" the clock asked in that same crackly voice. Dolly's shock turned to excitement. She loved stories more than anything. Without thinking twice, she answered, "Yes, please. Can you really tell me one?" The clock's hands twitched slightly, and it chuckled. "Of course I can. I will tell you the story of my life." Dolly's heart leaped. The clock was finally going to reveal its secrets. She leaned forward, eager to hear every word. Even the cricket, which lived behind the fireplace, stopped chirping to listen. The fire seemed to glow brighter, as if it too was leaning in to hear the clock's tale. "Once upon a time, my dear Dolly Dimple," the clock began, "there wasn't a single clock on the face of the earth." Dolly's eyes widened in surprise. "No clocks? How did people know when it was time to go to school or eat dinner?" she asked, baffled. The clock chuckled softly. "Oh, they had their ways," it replied. "Long ago, they used something very simple to tell time, a stick." "A stick," Dolly echoed, not quite believing her ears. The cricket, ever the skeptic, couldn't help but interrupt. "A stick? Oh, I've heard some crazy stories, but this one takes the cake." The clock sighed, its hands trembling slightly. "I was brought up to believe it's impolite to interrupt," it said with a hint of patience. Dolly quickly scolded the cricket. "Hush. We want to hear the story." "As I was saying," the clock continued, "people would plant a stick in the ground on a sunny day. In the morning, the shadow of the stick would be long, stretching across the ground. But as the day went on and the sun moved higher in the sky, the shadow would shrink. At noon, the stick's shadow would disappear completely, only to grow again as the sun moved west. People could tell the time by watching the shadow move. Dolly giggled. That sounds like a fun game. The clock hummed in agreement.
It was.
And soon, people thought of something even better, a sundial. It was like a little table with a metal piece sticking up. The sun would cast a shadow on the table, and the shadow would show what time of day it was. The cricket, who was listening intently now, asked, "But what about nighttime? You can't use a sundial in the dark." The clock's face seemed to twinkle. That's where things became tricky. People had to find other ways to tell time in the dark, like watching the stars or listening to their instincts. It wasn't until about 500 years ago that someone invented the first clock. It wasn't anything like me, of course. It had no pendulum, and it couldn't chime, but it was the beginning of something marvelous. Dolly's eyes sparkled with wonder. Were you one of the first clocks? The clock's voice softened with pride. Oh no, I came much later, but I have lived a long life. I was built over 100 years ago by a kind clockmaker who took great pride in his work. Every little piece of me was crafted with care, and when I was finished, I was the most beautiful clock anyone had ever seen. The clock's voice took on a note of sadness. But like all things, I've grown old. My hands no longer move, and my pendulum has stopped swinging. But I still have one purpose, to remind people to live their lives well. Every time I chime, even if it's at an odd hour, it's my way of telling the world, do right, do right. That's what matters most. Dolly's heart swelled with affection for the old clock. You're not just a clock, she said softly. You're a wise friend. The cricket, who had been quiet for some time, nodded in agreement. I think I'll be more respectful from now on, it chirped. Before the clock could say more, Dolly's brother, Harry, called from the next room. Dolly, where are you? It's your birthday. Time to celebrate. Dolly blinked and looked around. The fire crackled gently, and the clock stood silent, its face beaming down at her as if nothing had happened. Had it all been a dream? Dolly wasn't sure, but as she stood up and stretched, she felt a warmth in her heart. The clock may have been silent now, but Dolly knew it had shared its wisdom with her. And from that day forward, she always remembered the clock's message. Do right, do right.